November 16, 2017. It's late Thursday night in Gwinnett County, Georgia, a sprawling suburban community on the eastern edge of Atlanta.
It's one of the most diverse counties in the United States. So a lot of people come here because it provides a lot of opportunity.
It's away from the city. It's an easy commute back to the city. But Gwinnett is actually, pretty quiet. It's a good area to raise your family.
But for one local family, the suburban serenity is about to be shattered.
What's going on? Did you hear that?
It's just before midnight when Gwinnett County 911 receives a frightened call from 42-year-old Tia Young.
911, what's the emergency?
I just heard a gunshot.
Tia explained that her brother, Tim Lee, who also lives inside the home, heard the shots as well.
My brother just went to see what he could see.
Tia's still on the phone when Tim steps back inside.
It's George.
He told her that her husband had been shot.
He's at the front door, right at the back door.
His condition is critical.
He's laying on the ground bleeding.
Take a deep breath for me, okay?
Growing up in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, George and Tia Young were high school sweethearts who got married shortly after graduation.
He was an excellent husband.
They had such a good relationship together. I'm gonna be honest with you, I was jealous. They were like made for each other.
They had big dreams.
Those dreams brought George and Tia to Atlanta in 2005.
If you're looking for more, you're gonna likely be drawn to Atlanta.
You got people from out of town moved here, want to start a business or get involved in entertainment, sports. It's kind of place to be for African Americans.
In Atlanta, George found work in the security field.
He had done some security work back in his hometown in South Carolina, but the opportunities in Atlanta seemed endless.
The entertainment industry is rooted here, and it's ever expanding.
Entertainment does require security. It's really necessary, and it's really a big industry in Atlanta.
And George had connections.
Tia was really good friends with a woman who happened to be married to a guy that owned the most successful security company in town.
We've got several high-end clients. We've done Rihanna, Usher, Jay-Z. We've done a lot of them. We've had Shaquille. Whenever there was an event in Atlanta, they were going to call Strickland Security.
While the connection got George's foot in the door, his hustle did the rest.
He's just so charismatic, and he's just had such a welcoming spirit that, a lot of my clients I had prior to George joining me, they would always, hey, Mr. Strickland, I'm going to need you to come out here on this job yourself. But after George joined the team, it was, hey, can you send George? He was just highly requested by all the clients.
Despite the high demand, George somehow found time to start his own business.
He owned his own electronic security company, installing alarm systems.
Smells good in here, babe.
You're up early.
Yeah. Gonna be late tonight, babe. I got 3 big installs today, okay?
Okay.
George was known to work long hours, sometimes putting in 67 hours a week.
He was just relentless. Guys like this aren't born every day.
Tia was just as busy taking care of the couple's growing family.
She's raising 3 boys. She was committed to being a stay-at-home mom, taking care of the kids.
But George always made time for his kids, too.
He would always talk about his boys, and he always found a way to be there for his kids. There's times he would call and say, hey, I can't start this job until 2 o'clock because my son has soccer practice.
In 2012, George's hard work and Tia's loving support took their family to the next level. A gorgeous new home in Gwinnett County.
George had that hustle mentality where he's going to do anything for his family.
Gwinnett County is a quieter way of life, a slower pace to life, and an opportunity to perhaps buy a bigger home that they can buy in the city.
Gwinnett is more of the safe place where you think, okay, we can get a nice house for a certain amount of money and raise my family.
Hardworking and generous, In 2016, the Youngs opened their home to Tia's brother, Tim Lee.
He was catching some hard times in South Carolina, living in motels, sometimes not having a place to stay.
George reached out and invited them into the couple's home.
George, I can't, man. Are you sure about this?
Come on, man, your family.
To help Tim get back on his feet, George also got him a job.
George had approached me one day and said, hey, brother, I have a guy that I want to bring on board. He doesn't have any experience, but I'm going to teach him.
And that was just the way that George was.
He was just so amazing, such a down-to-earth and real individual.
But now, George lies bleeding just outside the home he'd worked so hard to provide for his family.
Home is where you're supposed to be safe, where your peace is. You get that close, you're on the threshold, and you don't make it. It's devastating.
Is your brother, or are you able to do CPR? Okay, can you put your brother on the phone?
While first responders race to the scene, the dispatcher walks Tim through CPR.
Okay, I want you to put your hands in the center of his chest. You're going to push down twice per second, and we're going to count out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4.
When first responders arrive, they find Tim still desperately trying to save George.
He was saying, don't die, don't die.
George, please.
Sir, we'll take this
Come on, George, please.
They take over the CPR from Tim.
There was nothing that they could do.
George Young was pronounced dead on the scene.
After moving to Atlanta with his beautiful wife and 3 boys, George Young was living the American dream.
He's having high-profile entertainers that he's doing security for, and it's just leading him into a huge position in this industry.
He was so proud of being able to be successful in the business aspect of getting the job done, but to manage that family role as well. He found a way to juggle and be successful.
But then, everything came crashing down in an instant.
Tia Young called 911.
It's George.
Indicating her husband had been shot.
By the time first responders arrived to give aid to George Young, he was dead.
George is still on his doorstep when homicide detectives arrive on the scene.
George Young never made it in the house.
He's laying in a pool of his own blood, keys in the door.
George's iPad and papers are scattered on the steps where he dropped them.
He was ambushed, bushwhacked in front of his house.
They shoot him twice. The first shot in the chest and the second shot was in the head.
They wanted to ensure that George would die.
But who was the killer? The crime scene offers few clues.
No murder weapon was recovered from the scene. They did recover 1 shell casing.
It's from a .40 caliber automatic pistol.
They were able to establish what kind of gun was used.
It was impossible to say whether the killer followed George home or if he had been waiting for him.
Although detectives hope by speaking to the neighbors who've gathered outside, they can find a witness who saw the killer.
People in his community were extremely shocked that something like that could happen in that neighborhood.
Several neighbors say they heard the shots.
We didn't know it was a shot. It sounded like a firecracker.
I thought it was something inside the house that fell.
4 seconds later, there was another.
And one neighbor had even heard the shooting's harrowing aftermath.
And he was like, George, don't leave me, don't die on me. And then I could hear the 911 operator trying to walk him through CPR.
However, the neighbors hadn't seen anyone fleeing the scene or anything suspicious in the neighborhood.
None of them had any idea who might want to hurt George either.
Nobody really had a bad word to say about George.
He's a hardworking man, hardworking father, loving father.
Hoping she may know more, detectives speak with George's wife, Tia.
By this time, Tia was able to regain some of her composure, and she arranged for her mom, who was also staying in the home at the time, to watch her kids.
Just kind of walk me through how you came about all this tonight, how you found out.
Tia explained that George was working security late at a mall in Buckhead for an event.
He told me this morning he would be home probably around anywhere between 11 and 1.
She says that since George was going to be late, she'd gone to bed early, at around 9:30.
But I don't think I dozed off to maybe like 10, I guess, down to 2:30, I'm guessing. I don't remember.
But Tia says she'll never forget how she woke up.
I heard a loud noise.
She didn't know if it was fireworks. She didn't know if it was gunshots.
Sometimes I don't know the difference between a firecracker and a gunshot, but I was wondering why somebody would be shooting firecrackers this time of night.
She goes to Tim's room. Tim's not there. She finds him in the kitchen working on his laptop.
I said, "Did you hear that?" And he said, "Yeah, it sounded like gunshots."
Did you hear that? The gunshots sounded very close to the family home, and out of fear for her safety and her children's, Tia contacted 911.
Tim runs and gets the shotgun that the family usually keeps just for protection, and he goes outside.
Tia says that Tim was only outside for a moment.
He'd ran back in and told Tia that it was George and that he had been shot.
The front door was wide open and I could see George's legs. That's it, because I don't want to see him like that.
Understand.
Tia says she has no idea why it happened.
Do you know of any reason anybody would want to hurt him or anybody in your family?
No.
By all accounts, this man has no enemies. Why is he dead?
I'm in shock. I just don't understand this. I really don't. It's just crazy.
She was just confused.
I don't remember hearing a car speed off or anything. That I can recall, I didn't hear anything.
We're going to do everything we can to try to figure it out, okay? There's got to be something that happened, something maybe tonight, somebody followed him home.
Tia says she's unsure, so detectives turn to Tim, who appears just as devastated by George's death.
Tim told the detectives that him and George were very close and that George had done so much for him.
I was living in motels until my brother-in-law was like, start working for me and just stay in the house.
Okay.
Tim's account of the shooting mirrors Tia's, too.
I was at my laptop doing work, and I heard a single shot. It sounded kind of close. And then seconds later, I heard a second shot, which also sounded kind of close.
Tim said that he was in the process of figuring out what was going on, but then Tia ran into the room.
That's when he'd grabbed the shotgun, stepped outside, and found George.
I grabbed his hand. I'm like, George, but he was just staring straight up. I kind of shaking him, George. Didn't say anything. He just, saw the blood.
He goes back inside, he lets Tia know, puts his shotgun up, and he goes outside and administers CPR for George.
I stayed beside him until an officer.
And like Tia, Tim doesn't understand why someone would want to kill George.
Any beef with anybody? Was anybody arguing? I mean, have you ever had anybody try to rob anybody? Anything that would make you, why you thought this would happen?
The only thing Tim can think of is that it might have something to do with their line of work.
We did security work for almost everybody. Actors, rappers, musicians.
Okay. And who was he protecting tonight? What was the detail for?
Tonight it was Little Yachty.
George Young was doing a security detail for a high-profile rapper.
When you are part of the team that's responsible for providing security to a high-profile entertainer, that comes with its own set of concerns and issues.
Now they're wondering, could someone have followed him home from that event?
Detectives investigating George Young's murder have just learned that prior to his death, he'd been working an event in Atlanta's Buckhead neighborhood for rap sensation Lil Yachty.
George loved the celebrity event so much. Whenever there was an artist or an executive protection, he wanted to be a part of that. And we knew Lil Yachty was going to bring a real big crowd.
The more popular you are, you got to have security. And people come up to these celebrities like they know them.
It was an environment where George always shined.
Anyone he met for the first time, he made them feel calm.
He really had a knack for just easing tension in situations that may have been escalating. He knew how to bring that down.
We did many events, and everything was just always spotless. George was he became my good luck charm for those events.
But now detectives wonder if George's luck had run out.
Something could have happened in Buckhead, and they followed him home.
You never know if there's a fan that is upset because they couldn't get to their favorite entertainer.
I know he's up there, that rap concert. I'm not trying to say there's always crime involved with that, but, you know, you never know.
Tim doesn't rule out the possibility, but he has little else to offer detectives about the killer's identity.
I didn't see nobody running, didn't hear no wheels squealing, nothing.
However, one thing seems certain. Tim had nothing to do with George's murder.
They did a gunshot residue test on his hands.
Anytime the police investigate a homicide, they are going to look at the people closest to the victim. It is standard operating procedure.
No gun residue or gunpowder was found on his hands.
They also tested swabs from Tia's hands.
The results of the tests ruled out Tia as her husband's killer.
The next morning, hoping to learn more about the hours leading up to George's murder, detectives reach out to his boss, Rob Strickland, who's still reeling from the phone call he received a few hours earlier.
I'm in the bed, and the wife's phone starts ringing. She picks up the phone, and then her voice says, "No, Tia, not George." And I heard that, and I immediately, I'm looking at her, my eyes are, what happened? What happened? She hands the phone to me, and Tia is saying, "Rob, someone shot George." Shot George? Where? In front of the house. And it was like an out-of-body experience. I'm going to myself, this has got to be a nightmare.
When they sit down with George's boss, it's clear detectives think there might be some connection between the murder and his security work.
The police said they needed to question me regarding the Lil Yachty event. And while in the interview room, they asked me a bunch of questions. What happened during the event? When was the last time I spoke with George? A lot of details. Was George in danger? Was there any issues?
According to Rob, the answer is no.
Nothing like that. So everything went well.
The event went great. Everything was perfect. No issues, no incidents.
By all accounts, it had been a good event. It had been a good night for George.
George was never in danger. Things just didn't add up.
Typically, when someone gets killed, they're involved in activities that can get you killed. They're drug dealing, they're robbing, they're gang banging, they're scamming people and whatnot. George Young wasn't doing any of those things.
I just don't see how this has anything to do with his work.
But is it possible detectives are missing something?
Typically, in a lot of homicide cases or any type of crime cases, there's always someone that is not going to tell the truth. Someone is going to hide certain information that is needed to connect the dots.
The first indication that something more might be going on comes when one of George and Tia's neighbors calls detectives with a tip.
Well, yesterday, before all the police showed up, I saw something strange.
The neighbor tells them that they saw Tim come out, run to George's car.
I saw Tim on the ground, messing around under the truck.
And then he got up and ran back around the house.
They wasn't sure, with everything just happening, what he could have done under that car.
Determined to find out, detectives bring Tim in for more questioning.
Could this be the piece of the puzzle that we were looking for?
Or is the puzzle about to get way more complicated?
When you went out there to be looking under the car, what were you looking for?
The tracking.
Tim Lee has just told detectives investigating George Young's murder that there was a tracking device on George's car.
That's what the neighbor saw Tim removing from George's car after the murder.
They were like, why was a tracker on the car?
Tim tells the detectives that it was George's idea.
He gave me the money to put a tracker on the truck.
Mm-hmm.
To find
his truck? Okay. And how did you monitor that tracker?
My app.
Okay.
The tracker had an app that was downloaded to Timothy Lee's phone.
All right. Can you show me that app? Can you talk about?
This is the app right there.
Tim's story leaves detectives with even more questions.
Why would George want a tracker on his car in the first place?
And the explanation opened up the floodgates.
He said that he had gotten involved. He wouldn't tell me the full story, but he said he got involved in something that he shouldn't have.
But Tim tells detectives he'd eventually learn the truth.
George got involved with a guy named Terrence Bannerman, who was running guns out of Florida.
Gun trafficking is a huge nightmare for law enforcement.
Weapons are smuggled from states like Florida and Georgia, where gun laws are more lax, into northeastern states with stricter gun laws.
He was transporting guns.
Sometimes in conducting your investigation, you may find some things that are not so flattering about your victim.
Could that explain why George had been gunned down outside his suburban Atlanta home?
You know how dangerous that stuff is, though, right?
Yes.
Tim says George had only gotten involved because he was desperate for money.
He said George was having some significant financial problems. Even though he was bringing in a lot of money was going out. He had a wife that didn't work. He had 3 sons. He had a nice house. He had several vehicles. And he was kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul.
And according to Tim, smuggling guns for Terrence Banderman had improved George's finances. But recently, he started having second thoughts.
He wanted out because he felt like it was too much.
Tim told detectives that walking away wasn't easy.
They would not let him because he said he met too many high-ranking people. And they were not the high-ranking people in the gun traffic. He said he met too many high-ranking people.
Tim says that's why George asked him to put the tracker on his car.
In the event that he goes missing, at least I know where the truck is.
Tim said that after he told the gun runners that he wanted out, George feared that they would try to silence him.
You're saying that this guy come here and kill George as he's coming home?
I don't think it's Terrence at all.
Or he set George up to get killed, or set out a hit on George, put out a hit on George.
That I'm not sure, but I do know that he has been ducking everybody trying to get out of it.
But is it possible Tim isn't as innocent as he claims?
There was one huge problem with Tim's story.
He didn't initially disclose that the tracker was on the car.
That means you're trying to hide something.
I didn't want the actual story to come out.
Tim said that he was just trying to protect George's reputation.
It was.
Tim also tells detectives that if they don't believe him, they should ask Tia.
Not too long ago, Terrence Bannerman popped up at the house and spoke to Tia.
And what did he tell Tia?
They need to talk because George is really messed up.
Had the mysterious Terrence Banderman followed up on his threats?
Clearly, the detectives needed to talk to Tia.
So we need to ask Tia, see if she can confirm what you told us about this gun dude showing up at the house, and that she knew if George was running guns or not.
But when they step out of the interrogation to call Tia, her answer isn't what they expected.
He said George had the whole gun running thing. That's what he told me.
Tia said she had no clue what Tim was talking about.
It's hard for me to believe he was safe.
Why would she do that?
I don't know. I know nothing about that.
When Tim Lee claimed that George Young may have been murdered because he'd gotten involved with illegal gun runners, detectives were skeptical.
If someone followed him there, they wouldn't have let him get out of his car and come all the way to the front door. They would have popped him as he sat in his car.
Why do it right at the front door where everybody can see and hear?
Tim informed law enforcement that his sister Tia could confirm his story and that a gun runner had come by the home and threatened her.
Let's see what Tia knows.
All right, sit tight, man.
But Tia's answer apparently wasn't what Tim expected.
Tia denied knowing anything about the gun running.
And he said George had this whole gun running thing. That's what he told me.
I know nothing about that.
When they update Tim, he seemed shocked.
I don't know why she's saying that, and you're telling me something different.
Tim says he doesn't know either.
He kept insisting that he was telling the truth.
I don't know where we go from there. I don't. Do you know what this Terrence guy looks like?
I've never seen him. Never seen him. I've just heard the name.
You've never seen him?
Not in person.
Despite their suspicions, detectives have no choice but to cut Tim loose.
Tia didn't back him up, so police had their suspicions of Tim's story that there was illegal activity going on.
It automatically put holes in his initial story about the gun running thing.
However, before detectives can dig much deeper, they're contacted by George's sister.
She said she had just gotten into town from South Carolina and she needed to speak to them.
When she sits down with detectives, she says she has urgent information about her brother's death.
There's so much that I want to tell you that I don't even know where to start. I feel like this is just crazy right now.
She started with what may be the craziest thing of all.
Tia doesn't have a brother.
While Tia had repeatedly referred to Tim as her brother, it turns out that they were not related at all.
Do you know him?
Yeah, I grew up with him.
Tim was one of George's friends from South Carolina.
And I don't like him. I never have.
Okay.
But George's sister suspects Tia may have had a different opinion of Tim.
She said that when she got to Tia and George's home earlier that day, she found Tia and Tim alone together.
Hey, Tia.
It was in the room with the door closed.
Hey.
Both of them.
The detectives were pretty quick to realize where this was going.
Do you think that maybe they were having an affair?
Possibly.
You start to ask questions. Was there some tension going on in the house? Was there things going on within the marriage?
George's sister says she suspects that was the case.
They never go to anywhere together. Every time he comes home, she would never come home with him. My brother, he would go on business trips, he would come home and visit. She would never come, ever.
She also said that George and Tia had stopped sleeping together in the same bed.
She sleeps on the couch in their bedroom, and she told me she has been for a while.
However, that isn't all she has to tell detectives.
My brother had a big insurance policy.
He did?
In fact, George's sister said that she found out about it from Tia.
She told me my brother had $1 million insurance policy months ago.
An unhappy marriage, a possible affair, and $1 million in insurance money on the line. For detectives, it all adds up to a motive for murder.
It's one thing, infidelity, but greed will have you to do things that is out of the norm for you. Extreme things like plot against someone's life.
When detectives follow up with the insurance company, they discover that Tia had called to file a claim.
The insurance company even had the call on tape.
Can you email us the recording?
The name of the insured person, please. George Frederick Young III. All right, thank you. And may I have your name, please? Tia Young. And your relationship to the insured? Oh. All right, thank you. Are you calling in to report the passing? Yes. I'm very sorry for your loss.
The fact that Tia reached out to the insurance company was not suspicious in and of itself, because she did have herself and the 3 kids to take care of.
However, detectives couldn't help but notice when Tia had made the call.
What day did he pass away? Last night, November 16th.
Less than 24 hours, Tia Young is checking on that life insurance policy? That had to throw up some red flags.
But despite Tia's urgent desire to cash in on George's death, detectives are still a long way from proving that she and Tim were behind the murder.
This murder happened in November, and here we are in the new year, and months are going by, and I'm getting a little anxious, and I started contacting Detective Smith. You know, hey, Detective Smith, what's going on? And he just kept, hey, take it easy, Rob, it's fine. The DA's office, they need more evidence.
The search for evidence leads detectives to subpoena Tia and Tim's phone records.
Unfortunately for police, there was no murder conspiracies found in the text interactions between Tia and Tim.
They didn't find anything talking bad about George. They didn't find any type of coordination on the phone saying, I hate George, or we're gonna set George up and we're gonna kill him.
However, the text messages leave little doubt about the nature of Tia's relationship with Tim.
They found some intimate text messages.
Some would even say sexual.
They were in fact involved in an illicit affair,
which could give detectives some leverage.
The reason I brought you back in here today is I have a follow-up question.
The detectives come at her with the text messages that they found.
Been having a relationship with Tim.
If you tell one lie, you got to tell another lie, and then that lie got to follow another lie. And so after a while, the lies begin to catch up.
Put on the spot, Tia tells the truth.
She had no choice but to just admit to the affair.
The sex part, the affair, I'm very, very embarrassed.
What detectives were really wanting to know is if Tia would be willing to admit to anything else.
This is your only chance to tell me what's really going on, because everything else looks really bad.
After detectives investigating George Young's murder confront his wife Tia with the steamy text messages she sent Tim Lee, she confesses they've been having an affair.
And you guys are still in a relationship now?
Yes, to be honest, yes.
Well, that's what I want is honesty.
To be honest, yes.
Police kept pushing, hoping that she would admit to plotting her husband's murder.
What it looks like is you're this hateful, horrible spouse that connived with your live-in boyfriend to kill your husband for money. If that's how it is, then that's fine. You can tell me that. But if that's not what happened, then this is your only chance to tell me what was really going on.
But Tia has no intention of confessing to the murder.
The only thing I'm guilty of is having an affair. Yes, and I'm not belittling it like it's nothing. I know that's a big thing. So I'm not saying it like, oh, that's all I did, but that is the only damn thing I'm guilty of, is that.
She said that the only reason she wasn't upfront with the police about the affair is because she was trying to spare her family.
I know my mom and my children would be very hurt by it, but if it has to come out, it has to come out.
And it would all come out, both the affair and the alleged murder plot. After the interview, detectives placed Tia under arrest.
Turn her face to the wall.
Police felt like this was all the evidence that they were going to get. And although circumstantial, they were wanting her to have her day in court.
When detectives bring Tim back in after Tia's arrest, he doesn't admit to the affair or anything else.
They were both interviewed one final time and placed under arrest.
Tia and Tim's arrests shock many who knew the family.
You have a man that is a great husband and father. A man that's doing everything any woman would want, and he's set up to be murdered.
It's really hard, because you try to think of reasons why, but you can't.
When Tim Lee and Tia Young go on trial for murder in March of 2019, there's no doubt that George was well loved.
It was definitely a packed courtroom. Clients of ours, all the people George had known in his life, the entire security team, law enforcement. There was just so many people there. It gave us all a chance to spend a little time together and talk about George, about the good times. But it was real tough.
In their opening statement, the prosecutors argue the motive for George's murder was simple.
Tia wanted to be with Tim.
She should have been woman enough to tell her husband that she no longer wanted to be with him and simply gotten a divorce.
But while a divorce might have left her free to be with Tim, murder could get the lovers $1 million payout.
They kill him over insurance policy.
Many people who decide to commit murder let greed control their actions.
And just before midnight on November 16th, they were ready to cash in.
They plotted and planned and waited till he came home.
The tracker that Tim planted on George's car let them know exactly when he would be home.
And just as George put his keys in the door, Tim made his move.
Tim, what are you doing?
George went over and beyond for a friend just to turn around and get betrayed like this. That's unreal.
These people were evil.
When it's the defense's turn, Tim and Tia's attorneys argue that prosecutors have proved their clients had an affair, but there's no evidence connecting them to George's death.
The case was 100% circumstantial, meaning that there wasn't any direct evidence. There wasn't any eyewitness testimony. There wasn't any confession.
They did not have a murder weapon.
They both tested negative for gun residue at the scene, but law enforcement was well aware that they could have scrubbed it off.
What the prosecutors do have, though, are Tim and Tia telling lie after lie.
Is the person that shot him still outside?
No, my brother doesn't see anybody.
She lied right off the jump. It's my brother. Now, you can say that's my brother because he's my best friend or something like that. But it didn't sound that way. It sounded like that was our blood brother.
People don't lie to get into the trouble. They lie to get out of trouble.
George has been running guns and he has been trying to get out.
No evidence was ever found about gun running.
All of the little lies, all of the discrepancies added up.
The final tally is enough for the jury to find both Tim and Tia guilty of murder.
I was very happy with the guilty verdicts and hope that somewhere along the line that they clearly understand how wrong it was of what they did and how bad it was for them to make a decision to hurt someone who trusted them both.
And they'll have plenty of time to think about what they've done.
Tim gets life with no parole. Tia gets life, but she has a possibility of parole in 30 years.
Sometimes I feel that she shouldn't have an opportunity for parole based on her involvement and based on the trust that was violated.
Not only did Tia betray George, she also betrayed their children.
It's hard not to think about the boys, not to think about what they were going through.
It's just such a tragedy for them.
Because Tim and Tia's greed took something from them that can never be replaced.
He was a family man.
I was blessed to have someone like that in my life. And to this day, I've never met anyone who could come close to George Young. And we all still miss him dearly.
It begins in the quiet hours before dawn, in a house that looks like every other house on the street. The kind with trimmed lawns, a white garage door, and children's toys scattered just enough to suggest life, but not chaos. The kind of house where neighbors wave politely, where porch lights glow softly through the night, where nothing ever seems out of place. On that August morning in 2018, the air in Frederick, Colorado is still. No wind presses against the windows. No voices echo down the sidewalks. The world feels paused, suspended in that fragile space between night and day. Inside, everything is darker than it should be. The bedroom is quiet, but not peaceful. The silence is thick, almost unnatural, like something has already happened and the walls are holding their breath. A suitcase sits near the door, recently dragged in after a late-night flight. Its wheels have left faint lines across the floor, a trace of movement that now feels final. The bed is slightly disturbed, sheets creased in a way that suggests struggle, not rest. Somewhere in that house, time has already broken. Hours later, when the sun rises fully and light begins to flood through the windows, the illusion returns, at least from the outside. A man steps into the driveway, moving with a routine that appears ordinary. He loads items into the back of his truck. His posture is calm, his gestures measured, almost rehearsed. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the way he avoids looking back toward the house. But no one is watching that closely. People rarely do. He gets into the truck and drives away. The neighborhood remains quiet. A dog barks in the distance. A garage door opens somewhere down the street. Life continues, unaware that something irreversible has already taken place behind those walls. By midday, the silence begins to feel wrong. Phone calls go unanswered. Messages remain unread. A friend grows uneasy. There is a subtle shift that happens when concern turns into instinct. The kind of instinct that tells you something isn't just off, it's deeply, disturbingly wrong. A car sits in the driveway, unmoved. A purse is left behind. Medication remains untouched. These are small details, but together they form a pattern that refuses to be ignored. And then the question emerges, quiet at first, almost hesitant. Where are they? It's a question that will echo far beyond that street, far beyond that town, until it reaches millions of people who will later watch, listen, and try to understand how something like this could happen. But in that moment, it is just a question hanging in the air, unanswered and growing heavier by the second. Inside the house, there are no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No overturned furniture screaming violence. Everything appears almost normal. Too normal. It's the kind of normal that feels staged, like a scene waiting for someone to notice what doesn't belong. The absence becomes the loudest presence. A mother is missing. 2 young children are gone. And the man who should be searching the hardest is standing in front of cameras, his face composed, his voice steady, asking for their safe return. He speaks the words people expect to hear, words filled with concern and hope, but there is something about the delivery that lingers uncomfortably. Something just slightly off, like a note in a melody that doesn't quite fit. At first, it's easy to dismiss. Shock affects people differently. Grief doesn't always look the way we expect. But as the hours stretch into days, that unease begins to sharpen. The smallest inconsistencies start to matter. The pauses between sentences. The lack of urgency in his eyes. The way his words feel practiced, as though he's performing a role he doesn't fully understand. The cameras capture everything. And the world begins to watch. But before the headlines, before the interviews, before the unraveling of a story that will haunt people for years, there is that single moment in the early morning when everything changes. A moment that no one sees, no one hears, but that leaves a permanent mark on everyone connected to it. It is easy, later on, to focus on the outcome. To look at the facts laid out neatly, to trace the timeline backward, to assign motives and explanations. But in that first moment, none of that exists yet. There is only silence and the faint, invisible fracture of a life that once appeared whole. Because this is not a story that begins with violence in the way we often imagine. There are no warning sirens, no dramatic confrontations spilling into the street. Instead, it begins quietly, almost invisibly, hidden behind smiles, behind routine, behind the carefully constructed image of a family that seemed, from the outside, to have everything. That's what makes it so unsettling. The house does not look like a crime scene. The man does not look like a killer. The life they built does not look like something that could collapse so completely, so brutally, in a single night. And yet, it does. As the day continues, the search intensifies. Police walk through the home, their eyes scanning for anything out of place. Friends gather, their concern turning into fear. The atmosphere shifts from confusion to dread, from hope to the quiet realization that something is deeply wrong. Still, there are no answers. Only questions. What happened inside that house? What could have driven someone to do the unthinkable? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, how well do we really know the people closest to us? Because as this story unfolds, it will reveal something far more disturbing than a single act of violence. It will expose the fragile line between appearance and reality, the way ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary darkness. It will force people to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it blends in. Sometimes it looks exactly like the person next door. In the days to come, investigators will piece together a timeline. They will analyze footage, examine evidence, and slowly, methodically uncover the truth. Each discovery will strip away another layer of illusion, revealing a reality that is far more horrifying than anyone initially imagined. But in this moment, at the very beginning, none of that is visible yet. There is only a quiet house, a missing family, and a man standing in the spotlight, asking for their return. And somewhere beneath that calm exterior, the truth is already waiting to be found. It is a truth that will shock the nation, not just because of what happened, but because of who committed it. A truth that will challenge assumptions, shatter perceptions, and leave behind a question that lingers long after the story ends. How could someone who seemed so ordinary become capable of something so monstrous? The answer does not come all at once. It emerges slowly, piece by piece, like fragments of a broken mirror reflecting a reality no one wants to see. And when it finally becomes clear, when the full weight of what happened settles in, it leaves behind a silence far heavier than the one that filled that house before dawn. Because some stories don't just disturb us. They stay with us. And this is one of them. Frederick, Colorado, does not look like the kind of place where a story like this begins. It sits quietly along the Front Range, where the vast plains stretch toward the distant outline of the Rocky Mountains, and the sky feels bigger than it should, an endless blue canvas that makes everything below seem small and manageable. In neighborhoods like Saratoga Trail, houses stand in neat rows, their driveways clean, their lawns trimmed, their fences low enough to suggest openness, but high enough to maintain privacy. It is the kind of place people move to when they want stability, when they want their children to ride bikes in the street and their evenings to end in soft, predictable routines. In the mornings, the neighborhood wakes gently. Garage doors hum open one by one. Coffee brews behind kitchen windows. Parents usher their children into cars, or toward school buses, exchanging quick waves with neighbors who feel more like familiar background than close friends. There is comfort in that rhythm, in the quiet understanding that nothing extraordinary is supposed to happen here. Life is meant to unfold in small, manageable moments, not in headlines. The house on Saratoga Trail blends in perfectly. From the outside, it looks like a home built for a growing family. Beige siding, symmetrical windows, a wide garage. There is nothing about it that draws attention, nothing that hints at tension or fracture. Inside, however, the space tells a more personal story. Family photos line the walls, capturing smiling faces frozen in happier moments. Toys are tucked into corners, evidence of two young girls who fill the rooms with energy. The kitchen counters hold the scattered traces of daily life, mail, keys, the occasional unopened package. It is lived in, active, and at first glance, full of warmth. At the center of that home is Shanann Watts, a woman whose presence is impossible to ignore. She moves through the house with purpose, her energy spilling into everything she does. Her voice often fills the rooms, not with anger or tension, but with a kind of determined optimism. She believes in structure, in plans, in building a life that reflects both success and happiness. Through social media, she shares that life openly, inviting others to see the milestones, the celebrations, the small victories that make up her world. Her phone is almost always nearby, not as a distraction, but as a tool. She records moments, documents routines, captures the laughter of her daughters and the quiet pride in her growing family. To those watching from the outside, her life appears vibrant, even enviable. She speaks about health, about ambition, about pushing through challenges. There is a sense that she is constantly striving, constantly building something better for herself and the people she loves. Her daughters, Bella Watts and Celeste Watts, bring a different kind of energy into the home. Bella, the older one, carries herself with a gentle curiosity. She watches closely, listens carefully, and often mirrors the emotions of those around her. Celeste, younger and more impulsive, moves through life with a kind of fearless joy, her laughter quick and unrestrained. Together, they create a dynamic that feels alive, unpredictable, and deeply human. Their presence transforms the house. Toys appear and disappear. Blankets are dragged across the floor for makeshift forts. Small shoes are left in unexpected places. There is noise, movement, and the constant reminder that childhood is unfolding in real time within those walls. And then there is Chris Watts. At first glance, he seems almost invisible compared to the energy around him. He is quieter, more reserved, the kind of person who listens more than he speaks. His demeanor is calm, controlled, and unassuming. He goes to work, returns home, and moves through his routines without drawing attention. To many, he appears dependable, even steady, the kind of partner who provides stability in contrast to Shanann's intensity. But there is something about his stillness that is difficult to define. It is not immediately alarming. In fact, it might even be comforting at first. In a world that often feels loud and chaotic, someone who remains composed, who doesn't react dramatically, can seem like a grounding force. Yet beneath that calm surface, there is a distance that is easy to overlook. A subtle detachment that does not announce itself, but lingers quietly in the background. The marriage between Shanann and Chris is not as simple as it appears online. Like many relationships, it exists in layers. On the surface, there are shared moments, celebrations, the visible markers of a family moving forward together. But beneath that, there are pressures that build slowly over time. Financial concerns, differences in personality, the challenges of raising children, and the weight of expectations all begin to create small fractures. None of them are dramatic on their own. None of them suggest the kind of outcome that will eventually unfold. But together, they form a tension that grows steadily, almost imperceptibly. Shanann's drive to create a better life often pushes the family into a pace that is difficult to maintain. There are business commitments, travel schedules, and the constant effort to present a life that reflects success and happiness. Chris, in contrast, seems to retreat further into himself. He adapts, complies, and continues to move through his routines, but the emotional distance between them begins to widen. It is not something that would necessarily stand out to neighbors, or even close friends. Relationships are complex, and from the outside, it is easy to assume that what you see is the full picture. But inside that house, the dynamic is shifting in ways that are subtle but significant. By the summer of 2018, those shifts have become more pronounced. Sharnan is pregnant again, expecting a baby boy she plans to name Nico Watts. The news, which might have brought renewed excitement, instead adds another layer of pressure. The family is preparing to grow, but the foundation beneath them is no longer as stable as it once seemed. At the same time, Chris begins to change in ways that are difficult to fully understand. There is a noticeable shift in his behavior, a quiet transformation that does not come with clear explanations. He becomes more distant, more focused on himself, more invested in a life that exists partially outside the home. That life includes Nicole Kessinger. Their relationship develops away from the eyes of the family, away from the routines of Saratoga Trail. With Nicole, Chris appears different, more engaged, more expressive, almost as if he is stepping into a version of himself that had been suppressed. The contrast between these two worlds becomes increasingly stark. On one side, there is the structured, demanding life he shares with Sharnan. On the other, there is a sense of freedom, of possibility, of escape. It is within that contrast that something begins to unravel. The tension between who he is and who he wants to be grows stronger, pulling him in directions that cannot coexist. The choices he makes during this time are not sudden or impulsive. They develop gradually, shaped by internal conflicts that remain largely invisible to those around him. Meanwhile, the house on Saratoga Trail continues to function as if nothing is wrong. The routines persist. The children laugh. Sharnan shares moments online, capturing the image of a family moving forward together. To anyone watching, it still looks like a life in progress, a story unfolding in the way so many others do. But beneath that surface, the foundation is weakening. And the most unsettling part is how ordinary it all feels. There are no dramatic confrontations spilling into the street, no visible signs of collapse. Instead, everything happens quietly, internally, hidden behind closed doors and controlled expressions. It is the kind of unraveling that does not announce itself until it is too late to stop. Because the setting of this story is not just a place. It is a carefully constructed reality, one that relies on perception as much as truth. It is a world where appearances matter, where the image presented to others can sometimes overshadow what is actually happening beneath the surface. And in that world, the line between reality and illusion becomes dangerously thin. As the days move closer to that August morning, the tension continues to build, unseen but undeniable. Each small decision, each unspoken thought, each moment of distance adds another layer to a situation that is slowly reaching a breaking point. From the outside, nothing has changed. But inside, everything is already in motion. To understand what was lost, you have to step away from the headlines and into the quieter moments that never made it onto camera. Before the interviews, before the investigation, before the name Sharnan Watts became part of a national tragedy, she was simply a woman trying to build a life that felt meaningful, structured, and secure. Her story does not begin in Frederick, Colorado. It begins years earlier, shaped by determination, setbacks, and a relentless need to prove, to herself more than anyone else, that she could create something stable out of uncertainty. She was the kind of person who didn't sit still for long. Even in moments of exhaustion, there was a sense that her mind kept moving, planning, organizing, pushing forward. She liked things to have direction. Goals were not abstract ideas to her. They were tangible, measurable, something to be pursued with focus. When she spoke, there was often a rhythm to it, a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from repetition, from having told herself over and over again that she could overcome whatever stood in her way. That drive carried into every part of her life, especially into her role as a mother. When Bella Watts was born, something shifted in a way that no amount of planning could have prepared her for. Bella was not loud or demanding in the way some children are. Instead, she carried a quiet sensitivity, an awareness that made her seem older than she was. She watched people carefully, absorbing their expressions, their tones, their moods. There was a gentleness in her, a softness that made her presence feel calming rather than chaotic. She liked routine, much like her mother. Predictability made her feel safe. Bedtime stories, morning greetings, the familiar rhythm of daily life, these were the anchors she held on to. When she smiled, it was often small but genuine, the kind of smile that came from feeling secure rather than excited. 2 years later, Celeste Watts entered the world like a burst of energy that refused to be contained. Where Bella observed, Celeste reacted. Where Bella hesitated, Celeste moved forward without thinking twice. Her laughter came quickly, loud and uninhibited, filling the house in a way that made silence feel unnatural when she wasn't around. She had a way of pulling people into her world, of turning ordinary moments into something louder, brighter, more immediate. She didn't just exist in the space around her, she shaped it, bending it to match her energy. Together, the two sisters created a balance that felt complete, each one filling in the spaces the other left open. For Shanann, motherhood was not just a role. It was the center of everything. She documented it obsessively, not because she wanted attention, but because she wanted to preserve something that felt fragile. Childhood, she understood, was temporary. The small hands, the mispronounced words, the way her daughters reached for her without hesitation, these were moments that would disappear before she was ready to let them go. Recording them became a way of holding on, of making something fleeting feel permanent. Through her phone, she captured their lives in fragments. Bella singing softly to herself. Celeste running across the room with unfiltered excitement. Family dinners, bedtime routines, quiet mornings filled with half-awake conversations. To an outsider, these clips formed a narrative of happiness, a life that seemed full and complete. But behind the camera, there were layers that didn't always translate. Shanann carried pressure in ways that weren't always visible. There were expectations she placed on herself, standards she refused to lower. Being a good mother wasn't enough, she wanted to be exceptional. Being a supportive partner wasn't enough, she wanted to build a life that reflected success, stability, and progress. That kind of pressure doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it appears in the way someone keeps pushing forward even when they're tired, in the way they refuse to slow down, because stopping feels like failure. Her health struggles added another layer to that complexity. There were days when her body didn't cooperate, when fatigue settled in deeper than she expected, when maintaining the pace she had set for herself became harder than she was willing to admit. But even then, she kept moving, kept documenting, kept presenting a version of her life that emphasized resilience over vulnerability. And then there was the future she was building. By the summer of 2018, she was pregnant again, carrying a baby boy she planned to name Nico Watts. The idea of expanding her family brought with it a renewed sense of purpose. There were plans to be made, rooms to prepare, names to discuss. It was another step forward, another piece of the life she was determined to create. But beneath that anticipation, there were subtle shifts in her world that she couldn't fully control. Her relationship with Chris Watts had begun to change in ways that felt confusing, even unsettling. The distance between them wasn't always obvious, but it was there, lingering in small moments. Conversations that ended too quickly. Silences that stretched longer than they used to. A sense that something was being held back, something unspoken but present. For someone like Shanann, who valued clarity and communication, that kind of ambiguity was difficult to navigate. She tried to address it, to understand it, to bring it into the open where it could be fixed. But not everything can be solved through effort alone. Some things resist explanation, slipping through attempts to define them. Still, she kept going. Because that's what she had always done. She continued to care for her daughters, to document their lives, to plan for the future that included all of them. She continued to believe, at least on some level, that whatever was shifting could be corrected, that the life she had built was still intact, still worth holding on to. And that belief is what makes her story so deeply human. Because she was not living in a moment that felt like the end. She was living in a moment that still felt like the middle, like something unfinished, still moving forward. She did not know that the small fractures she was trying to understand would soon become something irreversible. She did not know that the moments she was capturing, the laughter, the routines, the ordinary details of daily life, would become the last record of a world that was about to disappear. In those final days, there were still glimpses of hope, of normalcy, of the life she believed she was continuing to build. There were still plans being made, conversations being had, routines being followed. Nothing had stopped yet. Nothing had announced itself as final. And that is what makes the loss so profound. Because it was not just the loss of lives. It was the loss of everything those lives represented. The plans, the routines, the small, unremarkable moments that never feel important until they are gone. The sense of continuity, of a future that seemed certain enough to depend on. When people later look back at this story, they often search for signs, for moments that could have hinted at what was coming. They analyze the videos, the messages, the interactions, trying to find something that stands out, something that feels like a warning. But the truth is, most of it looks exactly like life. And that is what makes it so difficult to accept. Because if something this devastating can exist within something that looks so ordinary, then the line between safety and danger is far thinner than anyone wants to believe. The night of August 12, 2018, does not begin with violence. It begins with routine, with the quiet exhaustion of travel, with the kind of fatigue that settles into the body after long hours spent in transit. The airport lights fade behind her as Sharnan Watts makes her way home, her suitcase trailing behind her across concrete and tile. It is late, past the hour when most of the neighborhood has already gone to sleep. The streets in Frederick are still, wrapped in that familiar silence that comes when the world slows down and the day finally lets go. When she arrives at the house on Saratoga Trail, nothing appears out of place. The porch is quiet. The door opens the way it always does. Inside, the air feels the same, carrying the faint traces of a home that had been lived in earlier that evening. There are no visible signs of what is about to happen, no immediate sense that this night will be different from any other. She moves through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this countless times before. Shoes off. Bag set down. A glance around, perhaps checking for anything unusual, though nothing stands out. Her daughters, Bella Watts and Celeste Watts, are already asleep upstairs, their small bodies tucked into beds that still hold the warmth of childhood dreams. The house is calm, almost peaceful. Upstairs, Chris Watts is waiting. There is no dramatic confrontation waiting at the door. No raised voices echoing through the hallway. What unfolds instead is quieter, more contained, the kind of interaction that might not have drawn attention if it had been overheard in fragments. A conversation begins, shaped by weeks of tension that had been building beneath the surface. Words are exchanged, not necessarily shouted, but heavy with meaning. There are questions, perhaps accusations, perhaps attempts to understand something that has been slipping out of reach. For Sharnan, this is not an unfamiliar kind of moment. She has been trying to make sense of the distance between them, trying to find clarity in something that feels increasingly uncertain. Her voice may carry a mix of frustration and determination, the need to confront what has been left unspoken for too long. She is not someone who avoids conflict when something matters. She pushes into it, believing that resolution lies on the other side. For Chris, the moment unfolds differently. There is a stillness in him, a kind of emotional flatness that does not match the weight of the conversation. Where there should be tension, there is control. Where there should be reaction, there is restraint. It is not the stillness of calm, but something else, something more deliberate. His responses are measured, his movements minimal, as though he has already moved past the point of negotiation. What happens next does not explode into chaos. It compresses into something far more contained, far more controlled. The shift is sudden, but not loud. At some point during that interaction, something irreversible begins. Chris moves closer, closing the physical space between them in a way that changes the dynamic entirely. There is no warning that feels clear enough to react to, no moment where the danger fully registers, before it is already happening. His hands reach out, not in anger that bursts outward, but in a calculated motion that feels almost detached from emotion. The room does not fill with noise. It fills with pressure. Shanann struggles, but the struggle is contained, constrained by the reality of what is happening too quickly to fully process. Her body reacts instinctively, pushing against something that should not be happening, something that does not make sense within the context of everything she believed about her life, her marriage, her safety. There are no witnesses. No one to interrupt. No one to hear. The seconds stretch, becoming longer than they should be. For Chris, the moment remains controlled, his movements steady, his expression unreadable. There is no visible hesitation, no outward sign of conflict. Whatever thoughts are moving through his mind, they do not manifest in a way that changes his actions. The decision, once made, is carried through with a consistency that feels almost mechanical. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it is over. The room returns to silence, but it is not the same silence as before. It is heavier now, filled with the absence of something that had been alive only moments earlier. Shanann's body lies still, the space around her unchanged in appearance, but altered in meaning. The house, which had felt ordinary just minutes ago, now holds something that cannot be undone. Upstairs, the children remain asleep. For a brief moment, there is a pause, a space where time seems to hesitate again. This could be the point where everything stops, where the reality of what has happened interrupts the sequence of events. But it doesn't. Instead, the night continues. Chris moves through the house with a purpose that suggests he has already begun thinking ahead. There is no visible panic, no frantic movement. His actions are deliberate, paced, as though he is following a path he has already considered. The presence of his daughters does not interrupt that path. It becomes part of it. When he enters their room, the atmosphere shifts again, but in a different way. Bella and Celeste are not part of the confrontation that happened downstairs. They exist in a separate reality, one defined by sleep, by innocence, by the assumption that the world around them is safe. The transition from that reality to what follows is not something they can understand or anticipate. The details of what happens next are difficult to reconcile, not because they are unclear, but because they are so starkly at odds with what should be possible. The same controlled demeanor carries through, the same absence of outward emotion. The actions are methodical, disconnected from the natural instincts that would typically prevent such a thing from occurring. There is no rage that burns out of control. There is only continuation. The house, once filled with the quiet sounds of a family at rest, becomes still in a way that is absolute. No movement. No voices. No indication, from the outside, that anything has changed. The neighborhood remains asleep, unaware that within one of its homes, an entire family has been erased in the span of a few hours. By the time the first light of morning begins to touch the edges of the sky, the night has already completed its transformation. Chris begins to move again, transitioning from what has been done to what comes next. The process of removing evidence, of reshaping the narrative, begins before the sun fully rises. There is a sequence to it, a series of actions that follow one another with the same controlled precision. The bodies are moved. The house is adjusted. The appearance of normalcy is restored, at least on the surface. When he steps outside later that morning, the world looks exactly as it should. The sky is clear. The air is still. Nothing in the environment reflects what has just taken place. It is a contrast so sharp that it feels almost surreal, as though two completely different realities are existing side by side. One is visible, ordinary, unchanged. The other is hidden, irreversible, already shaping the events that will follow. And in that contrast lies the true horror of the night. Not just in what was done, but in how quietly it was done. How contained. How easily it slipped into the space of a life that, only hours earlier, had seemed intact. Because the most unsettling part is not the violence itself. It is the absence of anything that would have warned the world it was coming. By late morning on August 13th, the house on Saratoga Trail no longer feels like just another quiet home in a suburban neighborhood. Something has shifted, not in a way that can be immediately seen, but in a way that presses into every small detail, every unanswered call, every minute that passes without explanation. Concern, at first subtle and easy to dismiss, begins to harden into urgency. It starts with instinct. A close friend of Shanann Watts notices that something is wrong. The silence is too complete, too out of character. Shanann is not someone who disappears without a trace. She responds to messages. She checks in. She maintains contact in a way that feels constant, almost reassuring. When that pattern breaks, it does not go unnoticed. Phone calls go unanswered. Text messages remain unread. There is no activity where there should be. The concern escalates quickly. It is not just the absence of communication, it is the absence of presence. Shanann has appointments, responsibilities, a life that does not allow her to simply vanish. The longer the silence stretches, the more it begins to feel like something is deeply wrong. By early afternoon, that instinct turns into action. A car pulls into the driveway. The house stands exactly as it always has, its exterior unchanged, its windows reflecting the bright Colorado sun. But there is something unsettling about its stillness, a kind of quiet that feels heavier than usual. The garage door remains closed. No movement is visible inside. The front door does not open. There is no response from within. It is at this point that concern becomes alarm. Law enforcement is contacted, and soon officers arrive, stepping into a situation that, at first glance, does not resemble a crime scene. There are no signs of forced entry. No broken locks. No shattered glass. The house appears intact, undisturbed. But as they begin to move through the space, small details start to emerge, each one carrying more weight than it should on its own. The car is still in the garage. Inside, personal belongings remain exactly where they would normally be. A purse sits nearby, containing essentials that no one would leave behind voluntarily. Medication is present, untouched. These are not items someone forgets. They are extensions of daily life, things that move with a person wherever they go. Their presence here, without their owner, creates a contradiction that cannot be ignored. Upstairs, the bedrooms are quiet. The beds show signs of having been used, but there is no one in them now. The absence of Bella Watts and Celeste Watts is particularly striking. Children do not leave without leaving traces, noise, disruption, something out of place. But here, everything feels contained, as though whatever happened did not unfold in chaos, but in a controlled, deliberate manner. That realization begins to shape the way investigators look at the scene. This is not a break-in. This is not random. Whatever happened here likely involved someone who knew the house, someone who could move through it without creating obvious disruption. As officers continue their walkthrough, they begin to document everything. The placement of objects, the condition of the rooms, the subtle inconsistencies that might otherwise be overlooked. Each detail is noted, not because it immediately provides answers, but because it contributes to a larger picture that is still forming. And then there is the man who lives here. Chris Watts returns to the house, stepping into the unfolding situation with a demeanor that, on the surface, aligns with concern. He speaks with officers, answers questions, provides information about his wife and children. He explains that he last saw them earlier, that everything seemed normal, that he does not know where they could have gone. His words are clear. His tone is steady. But something does not fully align. It is not a single statement, or a specific action that raises suspicion. It is a collection of small things, subtle enough that they might be dismissed individually, but together they create a sense of unease. The way he speaks about his family feels slightly detached, as though he is describing a situation rather than experiencing it. His body language lacks the urgency that might be expected, the kind of restless energy that often accompanies fear or panic. Investigators do not jump to conclusions. They observe. They listen. They begin to build a timeline. One of the most significant pieces of evidence emerges not from inside the house, but from outside. A neighbor provides access to surveillance footage, a camera positioned in a way that captures part of the driveway. It is a small window into the events of the early morning hours, a perspective that exists independent of memory or explanation. The footage is reviewed. Chris stands nearby as it plays. On the screen, his truck appears in the driveway during the early hours of the morning. He moves back and forth, loading items into the vehicle. The actions themselves are not inherently suspicious, people load their trucks all the time. But within the context of a missing family, every movement takes on new meaning. Investigators watch closely. So does Chris. There is a moment, brief but noticeable, where his behavior shifts slightly as the footage continues. It is not dramatic, not enough to confirm anything on its own, but enough to register. A flicker of tension. A change in posture. Something that suggests he is aware of how this looks, how it might be interpreted. The footage does not provide answers. But it raises questions. Why was he loading his truck so early? What was he placing inside? Where did he go after leaving the house? These questions begin to shape the direction of the investigation. Inside the home, the absence continues to speak louder than any physical evidence. There is no sign that Shanann left voluntarily. No indication that the children were taken in a way that involved force from an outside party. Everything points inward, toward the people who lived here, toward the dynamics that existed within these walls. As the hours pass, the situation escalates from a missing persons case to something more serious. The lack of communication, the inconsistencies in Chris's statements, the evidence gathered so far, all of it begins to shift the focus of the investigation. The house is no longer just a home. It is a scene. A place where something happened, even if that something has not yet been fully uncovered. Outside, the neighborhood begins to take notice. Police presence increases. Conversations start quietly, neighbors exchanging information, trying to make sense of what is happening just steps away from their own front doors. The sense of safety that once defined the area begins to fracture, replaced by uncertainty. Inside, investigators continue their work. They photograph. They document. They collect. Each action is methodical, driven by the understanding that the smallest detail could become critical later. There is no rush to conclusions, only a steady movement toward clarity, toward uncovering what lies beneath the surface. And beneath that surface, the truth is already there. Hidden in the quiet. Waiting to be found. In the early stages of the investigation, uncertainty hangs over everything like a dense fog. There is no clear narrative yet, no definitive sequence of events that explains why a pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters have vanished without a trace. What exists instead is a growing list of inconsistencies, fragments of information that do not quite fit together, and a widening circle of questions that demand answers. Investigators begin, as they always do, by casting the net wide. Every possibility is considered. Every scenario is placed on the table, no matter how unlikely it may seem. Could this be a voluntary disappearance? The evidence argues against it. Shanann Watts left behind her phone, her purse, her medication, items that anchor a person to their daily life. People do not simply walk away from those things, especially not someone who is pregnant, responsible for 2 young children, and deeply connected to her routines. Could it be an abduction? There are no signs of forced entry. No indication that someone broke into the house, or coerced the family into leaving. The doors are intact. The windows unbroken. The absence of struggle suggests that if something did happen here, it was contained, controlled, and likely involved someone the victims trusted. Still, investigators cannot ignore the possibility entirely. They begin to look outward, examining the surrounding area, reviewing reports, checking for any known offenders in the vicinity. They consider whether someone could have approached the house under the cover of darkness, whether an opportunity presented itself in a way that went unnoticed. But as they dig deeper, the external theories begin to weaken. Attention shifts inward. The focus narrows to the people closest to the missing family, those who had direct access, those who understood the rhythms of the household. Friends, co-workers, acquaintances, each becomes part of the investigation, not because they are immediately suspicious, but because proximity matters. Interviews begin. Friends describe Shanann as organized, communicative, deeply involved in her children's lives. They talk about her energy, her presence, her habit of staying in constant contact. Her sudden silence does not align with who she is. It feels wrong, unnatural, like a piece of the puzzle that has been removed entirely. Then there is Chris Watts. At first, he is not treated as a suspect in the traditional sense. He is the husband, the father, the person who should be most invested in finding his family. But in cases like this, those closest to the victims are always examined carefully. Not out of accusation, but out of necessity. His interviews begin with basic questions. When did you last see them? What was the last conversation you had? Did anything seem unusual? His answers come quickly, almost too smoothly. He explains that Shanann arrived home late from her trip, that they had a conversation, that everything seemed normal. He says he left early for work, that when he returned, they were gone. There is no clear explanation for their disappearance, only a series of statements that maintain a sense of normalcy. But as investigators listen, they begin to notice subtle inconsistencies. The timeline shifts slightly depending on how the questions are asked. Details that should remain fixed begin to move, not dramatically, but enough to raise concern. It is not what he says that stands out the most, but how he says it. The lack of urgency. The absence of emotional fluctuation. The way his responses feel rehearsed rather than recalled. These are not definitive signs of guilt. But they are enough to keep the focus on him. At the same time, digital evidence begins to play a larger role in the investigation. Phone records, messages, social media activity, all of it is examined for patterns, for disruptions, for anything that might indicate what happened in those crucial hours. One detail begins to emerge more clearly. Chris has been communicating with someone outside of his marriage. Nicole Kessinger becomes a point of interest, not immediately as a suspect, but as someone who may provide insight into Chris's state of mind. Their relationship, once uncovered, adds a new layer to the case, one that introduces motive into a situation that previously lacked a clear explanation. Investigators reach out to her. Her cooperation is immediate, her demeanor open. She explains the nature of their relationship, how it developed, what Chris told her about his life. According to her, he presented himself as someone in the process of separating, someone whose marriage was already coming to an end. This contrasts sharply with the image of a stable family that others have described. The discrepancy matters. It suggests that Chris has been living two separate realities, maintaining one version of himself at home while presenting a different version elsewhere. That kind of duality does not prove anything on its own, but it introduces the possibility that he is capable of compartmentalizing in a way that could extend beyond relationships. Still, investigators do not jump to conclusions. They continue to build their case methodically. The surveillance footage from the neighbor's camera is revisited, analyzed more closely. Every movement, every pause, every action is examined in detail. The way Chris loads his truck. The duration of his time in the driveway. The absence of any visible movement from Sharnan or the children during that period. Questions multiply. If his family left after he did, why is there no footage of them exiting the house? If they were taken, why is there no indication of another vehicle, another person? The gaps in the narrative become harder to ignore. Meanwhile, search efforts expand beyond the house. Officers begin to look at Chris's workplace, a site operated by Anadarko Petroleum. It is a location he visited on the morning of the disappearance, a detail that initially seems routine, but begins to take on greater significance as the timeline is examined more closely. Why did he go there so early? What did he do while he was there? These questions lead investigators to consider the possibility that whatever happened did not end at the house. As the investigation progresses, the pressure begins to build. Chris is asked to take a polygraph test. It is a standard procedure in cases like this, a tool used not as definitive proof, but as a way to gauge responses, to observe reactions under controlled conditions. He agrees, maintaining the same calm demeanor he has displayed throughout. The test is conducted. The questions are direct. Did you harm your wife? Do you know where she is? Did you harm your children? His answers remain consistent with his previous statements. But the results tell a different story. He does not pass. For investigators, this is not the end of the investigation, but it is a significant turning point. The inconsistencies, the behavioral cues, the evidence gathered so far, all of it begins to converge into a clearer picture. The circle of suspicion tightens. Chris is no longer just a concerned husband. He is now the central figure in a case that is rapidly shifting from missing persons to something far more serious. And yet, even as the evidence begins to point in his direction, there are still unanswered questions. The full story has not yet been revealed. The details of what happened inside that house, and what followed, remain incomplete. But the illusion is beginning to crack. And beneath it, something far darker is starting to take shape. By the time investigators reach the point where uncertainty begins to give way to direction, the atmosphere surrounding the case has changed completely. What started as concern has evolved into something heavier, more focused, more urgent. The questions are no longer as wide-ranging. They are narrowing, sharpening, pointing toward a single center. And that center is Chris Watts. The shift is not sudden. It builds through accumulation, through the slow stacking of inconsistencies, behaviors, and evidence that, on their own, might not be enough, but together form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Investigators do not rely on instinct alone. They rely on convergence, on the moment when multiple lines of inquiry begin to intersect in the same place. That moment is approaching. The polygraph results linger in the background, not as definitive proof, but as a signal. Combined with his demeanor, his shifting timeline, and the lack of any credible external suspect, it creates a pressure that is both psychological and procedural. Investigators know that the truth is close, but it has not yet been spoken. So they prepare for the next step. The interrogation room is not designed to intimidate. It is simple, controlled, neutral. A table, a few chairs, walls that do not offer distraction. It is a space where time can stretch, where silence can become as powerful as words. When Chris sits down, he carries the same calm exterior he has maintained from the beginning. His posture is composed. His tone, when he speaks, remains steady. But there is a difference now. The environment has shifted, and somewhere beneath that calm, there is tension beginning to surface. The questioning starts carefully. Investigators do not confront him immediately with accusations. Instead, they revisit the timeline, walking through the events again, allowing him to repeat his version of what happened. It is a deliberate approach, one that gives space for contradictions to emerge naturally, for inconsistencies to reveal themselves without force. At first, his story remains the same. He last saw Shanann Watts after she returned home. They had a conversation. He left for work early. When he came back, she and the children were gone. He does not know where they went. But the more the story is examined, the more fragile it becomes. Investigators introduce details gradually. The surveillance footage. The lack of evidence supporting a voluntary departure. The absence of any indication that an outsider was involved. Each piece is presented not as an accusation, but as a reality that his story must account for. And it doesn't. The gaps become harder to fill. The pauses between his answers grow slightly longer. The confidence in his tone begins to waver, not dramatically, but enough to register. There is a sense that he is trying to maintain control, trying to keep his narrative intact, but the pressure is beginning to disrupt that effort. Then the strategy changes. Rather than confronting him directly with the conclusion that investigators are reaching, they introduce an alternative narrative. A possibility that allows him to shift blame, to move away from the position of sole responsibility. It is a technique used not to deceive, but to create an opening, to give him a way to speak without immediately facing the full weight of what that speech will mean. They suggest that something may have happened between him and Shanann. That an argument could have escalated. That emotions could have taken over. It is a subtle shift, but a significant one. For the first time, the idea that he was directly involved is placed into the conversation in a way that does not immediately corner him. It offers a version of events where he is still responsible, but not entirely in control of what happened. And that is where the breakthrough begins. His posture changes. It is slight, almost imperceptible at first. A shift in the way he sits. A change in the way he looks at the table rather than at the investigators. The silence stretches longer than before, and when he finally speaks, his words do not follow the same pattern they have up to this point. He begins to alter his story. At first, it is small. He suggests that Shanann may have harmed the children. That in a moment of emotional distress, something unthinkable occurred. He describes a scenario in which he reacts, in which he confronts her, in which his actions are driven by what he claims to have discovered. It is a narrative that attempts to redistribute responsibility, to create a context in which his actions can be seen as reactive rather than deliberate. But it does not hold. Investigators listen carefully, allowing him to speak, allowing the story to unfold. They do not interrupt immediately. They do not dismiss it outright. Instead, they let it exist long enough for its inconsistencies to become clear, for the details to conflict with the evidence that has already been gathered. The timeline does not align. The physical evidence does not support the sequence he describes. The story begins to collapse under its own weight. And as it does, the pressure increases. The room feels smaller now, the air heavier. The calm exterior he has maintained is beginning to fracture, not in an explosive way, but in subtle, cumulative shifts. The effort required to sustain the narrative becomes visible, reflected in the way he hesitates, in the way his words lose their earlier precision. Investigators press further, carefully but firmly. They return to the evidence. They revisit the inconsistencies. They close the gaps one by one, leaving less and less space for alternative explanations. And eventually, there is nowhere left to go. The moment does not arrive with dramatic declaration. It emerges gradually, as resistance gives way to inevitability. The story changes again, this time not in small adjustments, but in a fundamental shift. He admits it. The words come out, not all at once, but in fragments, in pieces that assemble into something far more definitive than anything he has said before. The responsibility he tried to deflect begins to settle back onto him, where it has been pointing all along. He describes what happened. Not with the emotional intensity that might be expected, but with the same controlled tone that has defined his behavior from the beginning. The details are given, the sequence of events laid out in a way that transforms speculation into reality. The room remains quiet as he speaks. There is no interruption, no immediate reaction. Investigators allow him to continue, to provide the full account, to place every piece of the puzzle into position. It is not about confrontation anymore. It is about confirmation. And with each detail, the truth becomes clearer. What happened inside the house? What followed afterward? The decisions that were made, the actions that were taken, the path that led from that early morning moment to the point where he now sits, speaking about it as though it was something separate from himself. By the time he finishes, the case has changed completely. What was once a missing persons investigation is now a confirmed act of violence. The uncertainty that defined the early days is replaced by a reality that is far more disturbing, far more final. But even within that clarity, there is something unsettling. It is not just the content of what he has confessed to. It is the way he confesses. The absence of visible emotion. The controlled delivery. The lack of hesitation in describing events that should, by all expectations, be overwhelming. It leaves an impression that lingers long after the words themselves have been spoken. Because the breakthrough is not just about uncovering the truth. It is about confronting the nature of that truth, and the person who carried it out. And in that moment, as the investigation shifts from searching to understanding, one thing becomes undeniable. The ordinary exterior that once defined this case has been completely stripped away. And what remains is something far darker than anyone initially imagined. Once the truth is spoken out loud, everything changes. The investigation, which had been moving through uncertainty and gradual revelation, shifts into something more concrete, more structured. There is no longer a question of what happened. Now, the focus turns to how it will be addressed, how the weight of what has been uncovered will be carried into a courtroom where facts must be formalized, where accountability must be defined. Chris Watts is no longer just the center of suspicion. He is now the confessed perpetrator of a crime that has already begun to reshape the lives of everyone connected to it. The calm demeanor he maintained during the investigation does not disappear entirely, but it exists now within a different context. The illusion of uncertainty is gone, replaced by the reality of what he has admitted to doing. The legal process moves quickly, but not without weight. Charges are filed with precision, each one reflecting a life taken, a decision made, an act carried out with irreversible consequences. The language of the law is clinical, detached in its phrasing, but beneath it lies something far more human. A pregnant woman. 2 young children. A family that no longer exists in the way it once did. As the case prepares to move forward, the question of motive becomes more central. Investigators and prosecutors begin to construct the narrative that will be presented in court, one that must not only establish what happened, but also why. The details that emerged during the investigation, his relationship with Nicole Kessinger, the growing distance within the marriage, the desire for a different life, begin to form a framework that explains the decisions leading up to that August morning. It is not a justification. It is an explanation. And even as it takes shape, it feels insufficient, unable to fully account for the magnitude of what occurred. The courtroom becomes the next stage of the story, a space where emotion and procedure intersect. It is not built for comfort. It is built for structure, for order, for the careful presentation of facts. But within that structure, there are moments that carry an intensity no system can fully contain. When Chris appears in court, there is a stillness to him that remains consistent with everything that has come before. He does not present as someone overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. His movements are controlled. His expression neutral. He stands within the process rather than reacting to it, as though he has already accepted the outcome long before it is formally delivered. The families of the victims are present. For them, this is not a case study or a legal process. It is the continuation of a loss that has not settled, that may never fully settle. They sit in a space where the person responsible for that loss is physically present, where the reality of what has been taken from them cannot be separated from the man who took it. The contrast is stark. On one side, the structure of the law, focused on evidence, procedure, and outcome. On the other, the raw, unfiltered impact of what those facts represent. The prosecution builds its case methodically. Evidence is presented not to convince of guilt, because the confession has already established that, but to provide a complete account of what happened. The timeline is laid out in detail. The events inside the house. The actions that followed. The attempts to conceal, to mislead, to maintain the appearance of normalcy in the immediate aftermath. Each piece adds to a picture that is already clear, but becomes more defined with every detail. The defense, in this case, does not attempt to deny what has occurred. Instead, their role shifts toward managing the outcome, toward navigating a situation where the primary question is not whether he is guilty, but how that guilt will be addressed within the framework of the law. There is a decision made early in the process. Chris Watts will plead guilty. The plea removes the possibility of a prolonged trial, of weeks or months spent revisiting every detail in front of a jury. It also removes the possibility of the death penalty, a factor that carries significant weight in the negotiations that take place behind the scenes. For some, the decision brings a sense of resolution, a way to avoid the prolonged exposure to details that are already deeply painful. For others, it raises questions about whether justice is fully served, whether the avoidance of the death penalty aligns with the severity of the crime. But the process moves forward. On November 6, 2018, the plea is formally entered. Chris Watts stands before the court and admits to the murders of his wife and children. The words are spoken in a setting that demands clarity, that transforms personal confession into legal fact. There is no ambiguity left. No alternate narrative. No uncertainty. The sentencing follows. The judge delivers the outcome with the same measured tone that defines the courtroom. Multiple life sentences, to be served without the possibility of parole. It is a punishment that ensures he will spend the rest of his life within the confines of a system designed to contain those who have committed acts beyond reconciliation. The sentence is final. But the moment does not feel like an ending. Because for the families, for those who knew Sharnan Watts and her children, there is no sentence that can restore what has been lost. There is no legal outcome that can fully account for the absence that now exists in their lives. The courtroom provides a form of closure, but it does not erase the impact of what has happened. During the proceedings, victim impact statements are delivered. These are not arguments or evidence. They are expressions of loss, of grief, of anger, of love that no longer has a place to go. The voices that speak in that moment carry a weight that cannot be measured in legal terms. They bring the focus back to what matters most, to the lives that were taken, to the relationships that were destroyed. Chris listens. Or at least, he remains present as the words are spoken. His reaction, if there is one, is not outwardly visible. The same controlled demeanor persists, creating a distance that feels difficult to reconcile with the emotional intensity of the moment. And that distance becomes part of the lasting impression. Because the justice system can define consequences. It can establish accountability. It can ensure that a person who commits such acts is removed from society. But it cannot fully bridge the gap between action and understanding, between what was done and why it was done. As the proceedings come to an end, the structure of the case begins to dissolve. The formal process concludes, the courtroom empties, the legal language gives way to the quieter, more personal reality that follows. Chris Watts is taken away to begin serving his sentence. The families leave with a form of resolution, but not peace. And the story, though legally concluded, continues to exist in the minds of those who followed it, those who try to understand it, those who are left with the question that still lingers beneath everything else. Not just how justice was served, but how something like this could happen at all. After the courtroom empties and the formal language of justice fades into memory, what remains is not resolution, but absence. It settles slowly, almost quietly at first, into the lives of those who were left behind. There are no headlines in these moments, no cameras, no structured narratives. Just silence, the kind that follows something too large to fully comprehend. For the families of Sharnan Watts, the world does not return to what it was before August 2018. It cannot. There is no version of reality where that loss can be undone, no path that leads back to the ordinary days that once felt so stable, so predictable. Instead, there is a new landscape, one defined not by what is present, but by what is missing. Grief does not arrive all at once. It unfolds in layers. In the early days, it is sharp, immediate, overwhelming. It exists in every thought, every breath, every attempt to process what has happened. But as time moves forward, it changes shape. It becomes quieter in some moments, louder in others, less visible from the outside, but no less powerful within. It finds its way into ordinary routines, into small, unexpected triggers, into memories that surface without warning. A photograph becomes more than an image. It becomes a reminder of a moment that can never happen again. A voice, once familiar, now exists only in recordings, in fragments that can be replayed, but never experienced in real time. The absence of Bella Watts and Celeste Watts is not just the absence of children. It is the absence of movement, of laughter, of the unpredictable energy that once filled the spaces around them. The house on Saratoga Trail no longer holds the same meaning. It becomes a place associated with something irreversible, something that transformed it from a home into a symbol. For those who pass by, it may still look the same, its exterior unchanged, its structure intact. But for those who know what happened inside, it carries a different weight. It is no longer just a location. It is a point in time, a moment that cannot be separated from the place itself. Eventually, life around it continues. New families move into the neighborhood. Children play in the streets again. The routines that define suburban life resume, as they always do. But the memory does not disappear. It lingers, not always at the surface, but present enough to be felt when the story is remembered, when the details resurface, when the quiet question returns. How did this happen here? That question extends far beyond the neighborhood. For many who followed the case, who watched it unfold in real time, who tried to piece together the fragments of information as they became available, the aftermath is not just about the individuals involved. It is about the broader implications, the unsettling realization that something so extreme could exist within something so ordinary. Chris Watts becomes a figure that people struggle to categorize. He does not fit neatly into the image of a violent offender that society often expects. There were no obvious signs, no public history of aggression, no clear indication that he was capable of what he ultimately did. That discrepancy creates a discomfort that lingers long after the case is closed. Because if someone like him can commit such acts, then the boundaries people rely on to define safety begin to feel less certain. It forces a re-evaluation of assumptions. What does danger look like? Where does it come from? Can it exist in places we consider safe, within relationships we believe we understand? These questions do not have simple answers. And that is part of what makes the aftermath so complex. For those who study cases like this, who analyze patterns of behavior, who attempt to understand the psychological factors that contribute to such actions, there are theories. Discussions about emotional detachment, about the ability to compartmentalize, about the gradual buildup of internal conflict that eventually leads to external action. But even within those frameworks, there are gaps, areas where explanation does not fully bridge the distance between understanding and acceptance. Because understanding is not the same as justification. And in a case like this, the gap between the two remains vast. For the public, the story continues to exist in a different form. It becomes part of a larger conversation about relationships, about the pressures that can build beneath the surface, about the warning signs that may or may not be visible. People revisit the details, analyze the footage, listen to the interviews again, searching for something they might have missed, something that could make sense of what feels inherently senseless. Social media, which once served as a window into the lives of the family, takes on a different role in the aftermath. The videos and posts that once felt like moments of connection become artifacts, pieces of a story that has already ended. They are revisited not for entertainment, but for understanding, for context, for the hope that within those moments, there might be clues that explain what came later. But most of the time, what they show is simply life. Ordinary, imperfect, real. And that, more than anything, reinforces the discomfort. Because it suggests that the line between normalcy and tragedy is not always visible. That it can exist within the same space, at the same time, without announcing itself. As the years pass, the case does not disappear entirely. It becomes part of a larger narrative, referenced in discussions about true crime, about domestic violence, about the complexities of human behavior. It is studied, analyzed, retold, each version attempting to capture not just the events, but the meaning behind them. For some, it serves as a cautionary tale. For others, it remains a mystery that, despite all the answers, still feels incomplete. Because even with the confession, even with the evidence, even with the legal conclusion, there is something about the case that resists full understanding. Perhaps it is the contrast between appearance and reality. Perhaps it is the quiet way in which everything unfolded. Or perhaps it is the realization that not all stories provide the kind of closure people expect. For the families, the aftermath is not defined by analysis or narrative. It is defined by memory. by the effort to hold on to the lives that were lost in a way that honors who they were beyond the circumstances of their deaths, by the challenge of moving forward while carrying something that does not diminish over time, but changes, adapts, becomes part of who they are. And in that sense, the story does not end with the sentence, or the investigation, or the headlines. It continues, in quieter ways, in the spaces where loss is felt most deeply. Because some events do not fade into the past. They remain present, shaping the way people see the world, the way they understand the fragility of the lives they build, the way they recognize that even in the most ordinary settings, there can exist something far more complicated than it appears. And that recognition, once it settles in, does not easily let go. In the months and years after the case formally closed, the story did not settle into silence the way many others do. Instead, it continued to evolve, not through new evidence or legal developments, but through the way people tried to understand it. The facts remained unchanged, the outcome final, yet the meaning behind it seemed to shift depending on who was looking and what they were searching for. For many, the question was no longer what happened, but why it happened in the way that it did. The focus turned inward, toward the psychology of Chris Watts, toward the internal landscape that could produce such a disconnect between outward normalcy and inward action. It is easy to assign labels after the fact, to use words that categorize and simplify. But in this case, those labels often felt insufficient, unable to fully capture the complexity of what had been revealed. There was no history of visible violence that escalated over time. No clear pattern that could be traced back through years of behavior. Instead, there was a man who, by most external measures, appeared ordinary. Quiet. Predictable. Stable. And that ordinariness became one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Because it challenged the idea that extreme actions always emerge from extreme personalities. Psychologists and analysts began to explore the concept of compartmentalization, the ability to separate different parts of one's life in a way that allows conflicting realities to coexist. In this context, it meant maintaining the role of a husband and father while simultaneously constructing a separate identity, one that operated under different rules, different expectations. That separation, once established, can become difficult to reconcile. The relationship with Nicole Kessinger became a focal point in these discussions, not as a singular cause, but as a catalyst. It represented an alternative life, one that existed outside the structure and responsibility of his family. Within that space, he appeared more engaged, more expressive, more aligned with a version of himself that had been suppressed or underdeveloped. The contrast between these two identities created tension. Not the kind of tension that necessarily manifests outwardly in dramatic ways, but the kind that builds internally, gradually, until it reaches a point where the individual feels unable to sustain both versions at once. In many cases, that tension leads to separation, to conflict, to the dissolution of one life in favor of another. But in this case, the resolution took a far more extreme and irreversible form. The question of why that happened continues to resist a simple answer. Some point to emotional detachment, the possibility that he lacked the depth of connection that would normally prevent such actions. Others suggest a gradual desensitization, a process in which the consequences of his thoughts became less real over time, allowing him to consider possibilities that would otherwise be unthinkable. There are also discussions about control. The idea that, in a situation where he felt constrained by expectations, responsibilities, and a life that no longer aligned with his internal desires, he sought a way to regain control in the most absolute sense. Not through negotiation or change, but through elimination. None of these explanations stand alone. They intersect, overlap, and sometimes contradict one another, forming a web of possibilities rather than a single, definitive answer. And within that web, the truth remains difficult to isolate, not because it is hidden, but because it exists across multiple layers of human behavior. At the same time, the case sparked broader conversations about the nature of relationships and the pressures that can exist beneath the surface. It highlighted the gap between what is visible and what is real, the way people can present a version of their lives that does not fully reflect their internal experience. For Shanann Watts, that presentation was rooted in optimism, in the desire to share a life that felt full and meaningful. Her use of social media was not deceptive in intent, but it inevitably captured only certain aspects of reality, the moments that aligned with the image she wanted to build and maintain. For those observing from the outside, that image became the reference point. It shaped expectations. It created a narrative that, when contrasted with what ultimately happened, felt almost impossible to reconcile. This disconnect led to a deeper examination of how people interpret what they see in others, how assumptions are formed, and how easily those assumptions can obscure underlying complexities. It raised questions about the signals people miss, the subtle indicators that may not register until it is too late. But even in that reflection, there is a danger of oversimplification. Not every strained relationship leads to violence. Not every internal conflict results in external harm. The factors that contributed to this case are specific, shaped by a unique combination of personality, circumstance, and decision-making that cannot be easily generalized. And yet, the desire to find patterns persists. Because patterns offer a sense of control, a way to believe that if we understand the warning signs, we can prevent similar outcomes. It is a natural response to something that feels chaotic and unpredictable. The challenge lies in recognizing the limits of that understanding. In accepting that some actions emerge from a convergence of factors that cannot always be anticipated, that human behavior does not always follow a predictable path. For those who continue to study the case, the focus often shifts from the actions themselves to the moments leading up to them. The small decisions, the internal justifications, the gradual shifts in perception that, over time, reshape what an individual believes they are capable of doing. It is not a single moment that defines the trajectory. It is a series of moments, each one building on the last, each one moving slightly further away from the boundaries that once seemed fixed. And by the time those boundaries are fully crossed, the person may no longer perceive them in the same way. This does not excuse what happened. But it provides a framework for understanding how such actions can occur without immediate external warning. As the years continue to pass, the case remains part of a larger conversation, referenced not only for its details, but for the questions it raises. It exists as a point of reflection, a reminder of the complexity of human behavior, the fragility of assumptions, and the limits of what we can truly know about the lives of others. For many, it also serves as a caution about the importance of communication, of recognizing shifts in relationships, of addressing conflict before it becomes something unmanageable. These lessons, while not universally applicable, offer a way to extract meaning from a situation that otherwise feels devoid of it. And yet, even with all the analysis, all the discussion, all the attempts to understand, there remains a core element of the case that resists explanation. A space where logic and reasoning reach their limits. A place where the question of why does not fully resolve, no matter how many perspectives are applied. Because at its center, this is not just a story about behavior or psychology. It is a story about choices. And the reality that some choices, once made, cannot be undone, no matter how much we try to understand them afterward. I and the time that follows the legal conclusion, when the structure of the case has already been defined and filed away, another layer of the story begins to surface, quieter but no less significant. It exists not in courtrooms or interrogation rooms, but in the long, reflective space where people begin to revisit the details with a different kind of attention. Not to determine what happened, but to examine what might have been missed. There is a natural tendency, after something so devastating, to look backward with sharper vision than anyone had in the moment. To replay conversations, to reconsider behaviors, to assign meaning to small details that once felt insignificant. In this case, that process becomes almost inevitable, because of how ordinary everything appeared before it changed. People return to the videos, the fragments of daily life that Sharnan Watts shared so openly. They watch them differently now. What once felt like glimpses into a happy, active household becomes something else entirely, evidence, not in the legal sense, but in the emotional sense. They look for pauses, for expressions, for anything that might suggest tension beneath the surface. But what they often find is not what they expect. They find normalcy. They find a mother laughing with her children, a woman organizing her life, a family moving through routines that look familiar to anyone who has lived a similar life. The moments are not staged in a way that suggests hidden conflict. If anything, they reinforce the sense that whatever was happening internally did not translate clearly into external behavior. That realization complicates the idea of warning signs, because it suggests that not everything leaves a visible trace. Still, people continue to search. They analyze the behavior of Chris Watts in those same videos, focusing on his body language, his expressions, the way he interacts with his family. Some notice his quietness, his tendency to remain in the background, his lack of overt emotional display. In hindsight, those traits take on a different significance, interpreted as detachment, as distance. But in the moment, they were not unusual. Many people are quiet. Many people express themselves differently. The challenge lies in distinguishing between personality and something more concerning, something that signals deeper internal conflict. And in this case, that distinction is not clear. The absence of obvious warning signs becomes one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire story. It forces people to confront the possibility that not all dangers are visible, that some exist entirely beneath the surface, beyond the reach of observation. It raises questions about how well we can truly understand the people around us, even those we live with, even those we trust most. At the same time, there is a parallel examination of the dynamics within the relationship. The messages exchanged between Sharnan and Chris in the weeks leading up to August 2018 become a focal point. They reveal tension, uncertainty, attempts to communicate and resolve issues that had been building over time. Sharnan expresses confusion, frustration, a desire to understand why the distance between them has grown. She seeks clarity, asks direct questions, tries to address what she feels shifting beneath the surface. Her efforts reflect a belief that the situation can still be repaired. That whatever is wrong can be identified and fixed. But those messages also reveal a gap. A difference in how each of them is experiencing the relationship. While she is actively engaging, trying to bring issues into the open, Chris appears more withdrawn, less responsive, less willing or able to articulate what is happening internally. That gap creates a disconnect, one that becomes increasingly difficult to bridge. For those looking back, this dynamic becomes another point of analysis. Could more have been done? Could the outcome have been different if the issues had been addressed earlier, more directly, more effectively? These are questions that arise naturally, but they do not have clear answers. Because relationships are complex, shaped by individual personalities, communication styles, and circumstances that cannot always be fully understood from the outside. What seems obvious in hindsight may not have been visible in the moment. And even when problems are recognized, there is no guarantee that they will lead to a different outcome. The case also prompts reflection on the role of external pressures. Financial stress, work responsibilities, the expectations associated with maintaining a certain lifestyle, all of these factors can contribute to tension within a household. They do not cause violence on their own, but they can create an environment where underlying issues are amplified, where small conflicts become more significant over time. In this context, the life that appeared successful and stable from the outside may have carried more strain than was immediately apparent. But again, this does not provide a complete explanation. Because many families face similar pressures without reaching such an extreme outcome. The focus inevitably returns to the individual. To the decisions made by Chris, the internal processes that led him to a point where those decisions felt possible. And it is here that the limitations of hindsight become most apparent. People can analyze behavior, identify patterns, construct narratives that connect events in a way that makes sense after the fact. But those narratives do not change the reality that, in the moment, the path forward is not always clear, not always predictable. The idea that this could have been prevented becomes both compelling and elusive. It offers a sense of control, the belief that if certain signs had been recognized, if certain actions had been taken, the outcome might have been different. But it also risks oversimplifying a situation that is inherently complex, reducing it to a series of missed opportunities rather than acknowledging the deeper, less visible factors at play. For the families, this process of reflection carries a different weight. It is not about analysis or understanding in the abstract. It is about memory, about holding on to the people they lost in a way that preserves who they were beyond the circumstances of their deaths. It is about remembering Bella Watts and Celeste Watts as children full of life, not as victims defined by a single moment. It is about remembering Shanann as a person with goals, with energy, with a presence that extended beyond the tragedy that now defines how many people know her name. In that sense, the story continues to exist on two levels. One is the level of analysis, where people examine the details, the behavior, the possible explanations. The other is the level of memory, where the focus shifts away from what happened and toward who was lost. And it is in that second level that the most important perspective often resides. Because while understanding the events can provide insight, it does not replace the need to recognize the humanity at the center of the story. As time moves forward, the case remains a reference point, a moment that people return to when considering the complexities of human behavior, the hidden layers within relationships, the fragile boundary between what is seen and what is not. But it also remains something more personal. A reminder that behind every case, every analysis, every attempt to understand, there are lives that existed fully before they were reduced to a narrative. And those lives, in all their complexity, deserve to be remembered beyond the questions they leave behind. After the legal process concluded and the official records were sealed into the timeline of criminal history, the story did not simply fade away. Instead, it shifted into a different phase, one that exists outside the boundaries of courts and investigations. It became something studied, revisited, and dissected from multiple angles, each attempt seeking to extract meaning from what remains fundamentally difficult to comprehend. In correctional custody, Chris Watts is no longer part of the world he once inhabited. The structure of his daily life is reduced to confinement, routine, and isolation from the environment in which the events occurred. There are no longer decisions that affect a household, no relationships that function in the way they once did, no external presence that defines identity beyond the label of his conviction. What remains is time. Unchanging, regulated, and detached from the life he once lived. But outside those walls, the narrative continues to expand. People revisit the case not for new developments, but for understanding. The absence of ambiguity in the legal outcome does not eliminate the psychological questions that remain unresolved. Instead, it intensifies them. The finality of the sentence contrasts sharply with the ongoing uncertainty about internal motivation, emotional detachment, and the sequence of decisions that led to irreversible consequences. The focus often returns to the contrast between appearance and reality. Before the events of August 2018, the image presented to the outside world was that of a functioning family unit. Photographs, videos, and social media posts created a visual record of a life that appeared structured, active, and outwardly stable. In those images, Sharnan Watts appears engaged in the process of building and maintaining a household centered around her children, Bella Watts and Celeste Watts, while also preparing for the arrival of another child, Nico Watts. Those representations, once ordinary expressions of daily life, become retrospective artifacts. They are no longer viewed in real time, but through the lens of what followed. This shift in perspective changes their meaning. Moments that once seemed routine are now examined for emotional cues, behavioral patterns, or signs that might retrospectively align with what is known to have occurred later. However, what often emerges from this re-examination is not clarity, but contradiction. The same footage that some interpret as containing subtle indicators of emotional distance is also seen by others as entirely typical of family life. The same expressions that are now analyzed for hidden meaning were, at the time, simply part of everyday interaction. This divergence in interpretation highlights one of the central difficulties in understanding cases like this: the human tendency to reconstruct meaning after the fact. In psychological discussions surrounding the case, attention frequently turns to the concept of internal compartmentalization. This refers to the ability of an individual to separate conflicting aspects of identity or experience into distinct mental frameworks that do not fully interact with one another. In extreme cases, this separation can allow behaviors or decisions to occur without immediate emotional integration or acknowledgement of their broader implications. In the context of this case, such theories are often used as a lens rather than an explanation. They provide a structure for thinking about how someone could maintain outward normalcy while simultaneously engaging in actions that are fundamentally incompatible with that image. But even within these frameworks, there is no single point of resolution. The human mind does not operate in linear or fully transparent ways, and attempts to map behavior onto simple models often encounter limits. Another area of focus involves relational dynamics and emotional disconnection. The relationship between Chris and Sharnan is frequently analyzed in terms of communication patterns, perceived imbalance in emotional investment, and the accumulation of unresolved tension over time. These discussions highlight the importance of understanding how gradual shifts within relationships can go unnoticed until they reach a critical threshold. However, it is also important to recognize that many relationships experience strain without resulting in catastrophic outcomes. The presence of conflict or distance does not inherently predict future violence. This distinction is crucial in preventing the oversimplification of complex human interactions. The case also prompted broader reflection on the nature of perception itself. What does it mean to truly know someone? How much of a person's internal experience is accessible to those around them? And to what extent do social expectations influence the way individuals present themselves in relationships, communities, and digital spaces? These questions extend beyond the specifics of the case and enter into broader discussions about modern life, where digital representation often coexists with private reality in ways that are not always aligned. The curated nature of online expression can create a version of life that emphasizes selected moments, while omitting the quieter, or more difficult aspects that exist between them. In the case of Sharnan, her online presence reflected a strong focus on family, health, and personal development. This presentation was not inherently misleading, but it was necessarily selective. All forms of self-expression are selective to some degree. The limitation lies in how those selections are interpreted by external observers who do not have access to the full context. After the events became public, this gap between perception and reality became a central point of discussion. It raised questions about whether warning signs were present but unnoticed, or whether they were not visible in a meaningful way at all. The difficulty in answering this question lies in the nature of hindsight bias, the tendency to interpret past events in a way that makes outcomes appear more predictable than they actually were at the time. In reviewing the case, it becomes clear that many of the elements now considered significant were, in their original context, ambiguous. Ambiguity is a common feature of human behavior. It does not always indicate hidden meaning or impending outcome. Often, it simply reflects the complexity of everyday life. For those closest to the victims, however, analysis is not the primary focus. Memory is. The effort to preserve who Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts were outside of the context of the crime becomes a central part of the ongoing emotional process. This involves not only recalling events, but also maintaining identity against the reduction of those individuals to a single moment in time. Grief, in this sense, becomes an act of resistance against simplification. It resists the idea that a life can be fully defined by its ending. As years pass, the intensity of public attention diminishes, but the case remains present within cultural memory. It is referenced in discussions about criminal psychology, domestic relationships, and the unpredictability of human behavior. It serves as a point of reference not because it is unique in its existence of violence, but because of the contrast it presents between outward appearance and internal reality. That contrast continues to unsettle people. Because it challenges assumptions about predictability, about familiarity, about the degree to which surface-level observation can be trusted as a complete representation of truth. Ultimately, the case does not offer a simple lesson. It offers complexity. And within that complexity lies the enduring reason it continues to be examined long after the legal proceedings have ended. Not because it can be fully understood, but because it forces an acknowledgement of how much remains beyond understanding.